I never thought silence could feel so heavy until the morning my mother's will was scheduled to be read. The house smelled like lemon polish and old paper, the way it always did when something important was about to happen. My mother believed in order when life was unraveling. Even after she passed, that belief lingered in the air, pressing down on us, daring us to behave. My sister Clara arrived first, clicking through the front door in heels that were far too loud for a grieving house. She was dressed in black silk, perfectly tailored, the kind of outfit you wear when you expect to win something. Clara had always dressed for victory. She hugged me lightly, her arms stiff, her cheek barely touching mine. Her eyes scanned me the way they always did, as if measuring whether I'd finally grown into something worth acknowledging. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "I didn't sleep," I answered. That was true. I hadn't slept well since my mother died, and not just because I missed her. There were things she'd said in her last weeks, half-formed sentences and long looks that felt like unfinished conversations, things I hadn't known how to ask about until it was too late. The lawyer arrived next, clearing his throat as if he were stepping onto a stage. Then came Clara's husband, Daniel, already checking his phone, already somewhere else. And then there was the empty chair beside me, the one I'd saved. When the door opened again, the room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that I felt it in my chest. The man who stepped inside wore a coat that had seen better years, the sleeves frayed, the shoulders slumped like they'd been carrying the weight of weather and time. His shoes were clean but worn thin, his hair gray and unstyled, his beard trimmed with care that suggested pride even when circumstances didn't cooperate. Clara stared. Daniel frowned. The lawyer blinked, confused. "This is a private meeting," Clara said sharply, standing halfway out of her chair. "You must be lost." The man looked at me, not her. His eyes were steady, dark, and familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be," he said quietly. "I invited him," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. My heart was beating too fast, but I kept my hands folded in my lap. "This is Samuel." Clara let out a short laugh, the kind she used when she thought someone was joking badly. "You brought a beggar to Mom's inheritance meeting?" Samuel flinched, just slightly. I felt it like a sting across my own skin. "He's not a beggar, he's my guest." My sister's eyes hardened. "This is unbelievable. You always had a flair for dramatics, but this?" She gestured at Samuel like he was a misplaced piece of furniture. "This is pathetic." I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that defending myself to Clara only gave her more material to twist. Instead, I thought about the first time I met Samuel, 3 weeks ago, on a bench outside the hospice center. I'd gone there alone that day, unable to sit in my apartment with its 2 quiet walls. Samuel was feeding crumbs to pigeons, tearing bread with careful fingers. We started talking the way strangers sometimes do when neither of them has anywhere else to be. About the weather, about how hospitals make time feel strange, about my mother, though I didn't tell him who she was, only that she was dying and that I didn't know how to say goodbye properly. He listened, really listened, not the way people nod while waiting for their turn to speak, but the way my mother used to, eyes soft, attention complete. When I cried, he didn't rush me. When I stopped talking, he didn't fill the silence. We met again the next day, and the next. Each time his presence grounded me. He never asked for money, never asked for anything at all. When I finally offered to buy him lunch, he accepted with quiet gratitude and insisted on choosing the cheapest thing on the menu. There was something about him that felt anchored, like he knew who he was, even if the world didn't. Back in the living room, the lawyer cleared his throat again. "If everyone is present," he said cautiously, glancing at Samuel, "we can begin." Clara shot me a look that promised consequences. She sat back down slowly, her lips pressed together. "Fine," she said. "Let's get this over with." As the lawyer began reading, I watched Clara instead of listening. She leaned forward at the mention of property, nodded at the allocation of accounts, smiled finely when the house was mentioned. It was all exactly as she'd predicted, exactly as she'd planned for years. Clara had always been close to her mother in ways that counted on paper. She managed appointments, oversaw renovations, and made sure her name was attached to every responsibility that looked impressive from the outside. I was the emotional one, the one who visited without an agenda, the one who listened to stories that had been told 100 times before and pretended they were new because it made her mother happy. "And finally," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, "there is a personal letter." Clara's smile tightened. Letters were wild cards. She didn't like wild cards. The lawyer unfolded the paper carefully. "To my daughters. If you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to explain myself. Some truths are easier to leave behind than to speak aloud." My breath caught. "I ask that you listen to each other, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And I ask that you look closely at the man sitting with you today, because his presence is not an accident." The room went still. Clara's head snapped toward Samuel. "What is this? What kind of game is this?" Samuel looked at me, his expression unreadable. I hadn't told him about the letter. I hadn't known. "There are parts of my life I was not brave enough to share," the lawyer read on, his voice steady despite the tension. "Choices I made before you were born and consequences that followed me quietly. I loved you both in the ways I knew how, even when I failed." Clara stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is absurd. I won't sit here and be manipulated by some stranger." Samuel rose slowly, not defensively, but with a dignity that filled the space he occupied. "I never wanted to be here like this," he said softly, "but your mother asked me to come. She said it was time." Clara stared at him, really stared at him, her confidence faltering for the first time. I saw it then, the way her eyes traced his face, the slight tilt of her head, the confusion blooming into something like fear. "No," she whispered, "that's not possible." I didn't yet know what she was seeing. I only knew that whatever it was, it had finally silenced her. Clara's hand trembled as she lowered herself back into her chair, though she tried to disguise it by smoothing her skirt. Daniel leaned toward her, whispering something urgent, but she shook her head, eyes never leaving Samuel. The lawyer paused, sensing that whatever was unfolding mattered more than his carefully organized papers. "I think," Samuel said gently, "your mother wanted you to hear the rest." "Finish it," I said to the lawyer, my throat tight. I felt like the floor beneath us had shifted, and we were all trying to remember how to stand. He nodded and continued reading. "The man you see today was once the greatest love of my life, before marriage, before children, before the choices that shaped our family. I lost him because I was afraid of scandal, afraid of instability, afraid of choosing a life that didn't look respectable." Clara let out a strangled sound. "No," she said again, louder now. "You're lying. My mother would never." "She would," I whispered, because suddenly pieces were sliding into place. My mother's long pauses, the old songs she hummed when she thought no one was listening, the way she once told me that loving someone doesn't mean you get to keep them. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, like he was bracing himself against a memory. "Her name was Eleanor back then," he said. "She was brilliant and terrified." The lawyer went on. "Samuel and I planned to leave together. I was pregnant and didn't know it yet. When I found out, I panicked. I chose safety. I chose the man who would become your father. I told Samuel I didn't love him anymore. I told him to disappear." Daniel straightened, color draining from his face. "Wait," he said. "Pregnant?" Clara stood again, this time gripping the table. "Stop reading," she ordered. "This is obscene." But the lawyer didn't stop. I later learned that Samuel never knew about the pregnancy. I never told him. I thought it would be easier for everyone if the truth stayed buried. I was wrong. The room felt too small, too tight. I felt my pulse in my ears. Samuel's voice shook when he spoke. "I found out a year ago," he said, "when she reached out to me. She was sick. She said she didn't want to die carrying a lie." Clara laughed then, a brittle, hollow sound. "So what?" she said. "You show up now dressed like that and expect what? Applause? Money?" Samuel looked at her with sadness that made my chest ache. "I didn't come for money." "Then why are you here?" she snapped. He looked at me. "Because she asked me to meet my daughter." The word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Daniel swore under his breath. The lawyer set the letter down, hands clasped tightly together. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as tears welled up, not from shock, but from recognition, the feeling I'd had from the beginning, the familiarity I couldn't name. "You're lying," Clara said weakly. "You're lying to hurt us." Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn soft. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "That's her, when we were young." Clara stared at the picture, her face drained of all color. That's Mom. Before responsibility, before fear. The lawyer cleared his throat again. "There's more," he said. "Eleanor left instructions for a DNA test, which was completed prior to her passing." He opened a folder and pushed another document forward. "The results confirm that Samuel is the biological father of—" "Don't!" Clara said, pressing her palms to her ears. "Don't say it!" "Of Anna," the lawyer finished. My name. I felt like I was falling and floating at the same time. Memories flashed my mind, my mother brushing my hair, telling me I had my father's eyes, her eyes filling with something unreadable whenever she said it. All the times she'd chosen me, quietly, without explanation. All the times Clara accused me of being favored, and I couldn't understand why. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, like he was bracing himself against a memory. "Her name was Eleanor back then," he said. "She was brilliant and terrified." The lawyer went on. "Samuel and I planned to leave together. I was pregnant and didn't know it yet. When I found out, I panicked. I chose safety. I chose the man who would become your father. I told Samuel I didn't love him anymore. I told him to disappear." Daniel straightened, color draining from his face. "Wait," he said. "Pregnant?" Clara stood again, this time gripping the table. "Stop reading," she ordered. "This is obscene." But the lawyer didn't stop. I later learned that Samuel never knew about the pregnancy. I never told him. I thought it would be easier for everyone if the truth stayed buried. I was wrong. The room felt too small, too tight. I felt my pulse in my ears. Samuel's voice shook when he spoke. "I found out a year ago," he said, "when she reached out to me. She was sick. She said she didn't want to die carrying a lie." Clara laughed then, a brittle, hollow sound. "So what?" she said. "You show up now dressed like that and expect what? Applause? Money?" Samuel looked at her with sadness that made my chest ache. "I didn't come for money." "Then why are you here?" she snapped. He looked at me. "Because she asked me to meet my daughter." The word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Daniel swore under his breath. The lawyer set the letter down, hands clasped tightly together. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as tears welled up, not from shock, but from recognition, the feeling I'd had from the beginning, the familiarity I couldn't name. "You're lying," Clara said weakly. "You're lying to hurt us." Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn soft. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "That's her, when we were young." Clara stared at the picture, her face drained of all color. That's Mom. Before. Before responsibility, before fear. The lawyer cleared his throat again. "There's more," he said. "Eleanor left instructions for a DNA test, which was completed prior to her passing." He opened a folder and pushed another document forward. "The results confirm that Samuel is the biological father of—" "Don't!" Clara said, pressing her palms to her ears. "Don't say it!" "Of Anna," the lawyer finished. My name. I felt like I was falling and floating at the same time. Memories flashed my mind, my mother brushing my hair, telling me I had my father's eyes, her eyes filling with something unreadable whenever she said it. All the times she'd chosen me, quietly, without explanation, all the times Clara accused me of being favored, and I couldn't understand why. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, like he was bracing himself against a memory. "Her name was Eleanor back then," he said. "She was brilliant and terrified." The lawyer went on. "Samuel and I planned to leave together. I was pregnant and didn't know it yet. When I found out, I panicked. I chose safety. I chose the man who would become your father. I told Samuel I didn't love him anymore. I told him to disappear." Daniel straightened, color draining from his face. "Wait," he said. "Pregnant?" Clara stood again, this time gripping the table. "Stop reading," she ordered. "This is obscene." But the lawyer didn't stop. "I later learned that Samuel never knew about the pregnancy. I never told him. I thought it would be easier for everyone if the truth stayed buried. I was wrong." The room felt too small, too tight. I felt my pulse in my ears. Samuel's voice shook when he spoke. "I found out a year ago," he said, "when she reached out to me. She was sick. She said she didn't want to die carrying a lie." Clara laughed then, a brittle, hollow sound. "So what?" she said. "You show up now dressed like that and expect what? Applause? Money?" Samuel looked at her with sadness that made my chest ache. "I didn't come for money." "Then why are you here?" she snapped. He looked at me. "Because she asked me to meet my daughter." The word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Daniel swore under his breath. The lawyer set the letter down, hands clasped tightly together. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as tears welled up, not from shock, but from recognition, the feeling I'd had from the beginning, the familiarity I couldn't name. "You're lying," Clara said weakly. "You're lying to hurt us." Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn soft. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "That's her, when we were young." Clara stared at the picture, her face drained of all color. That's Mom. Before. Before responsibility, before fear. The lawyer cleared his throat again. "There's more," he said. "Eleanor left instructions for a DNA test, which was completed prior to her passing." He opened a folder and pushed another document forward. "The results confirm that Samuel is the biological father." The days after the inheritance meeting felt unreal, like I was walking through someone else's life wearing my own face. News like that doesn't arrive all at once. It echoes. Every memory becomes a question. Every familiar feeling asks to be reinterpreted. I stayed at my mother's house, sleeping in my childhood room, surrounded by objects that suddenly felt like evidence. Samuel stayed too, but not inside. He refused the guest room, insisting he was more comfortable in the small studio apartment above the old garage, a space my mother had once used for storage. I realized later that she'd already made room for him, quietly, the way she did everything important. That first morning, I found him in the kitchen before sunrise, carefully washing a single mug. He looked startled when he saw me, like he'd been caught doing something private. "I didn't want to wake you," he said. You didn't, I replied. I couldn't sleep anyway. We stood there unsure of how to begin. There's no script for suddenly meeting your father at 42 years old, no gentle build-up, just a chasm and the hope that a bridge might form if you're patient enough. I keep thinking, I said finally, that I should feel angry. He nodded. That would make sense. But I don't, I admitted. I feel relieved and sad and curious all at once. He smiled softly. Your mother used to say you felt things in layers. I laughed, startled. She said that? All the time. That simple sentence did something to me. It stitched him into my history in a way no document ever could. Later that day, Clara called. I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing, my chest tight. I wasn't ready. When she called again the next evening, I answered. You humiliated me, she said without greeting. I didn't plan any of this. That man, your father, he walked in like a saint, as if he hadn't destroyed everything I thought I knew. I closed my eyes. He didn't know either. Silence crackled on the line. Do you know what it's like, she said, her voice breaking despite herself, to realize your entire sense of belonging was built on a lie? Yes, I said quietly, I do. She hung up. Samuel never spoke badly about Clara. When I ranted, he listened. When I cried, he waited. He told me stories about my mother before motherhood shaped her edges, how she laughed too loud at bad jokes, how she believed running away was sometimes an act of courage. She loved you fiercely, he said one afternoon as we sorted through old boxes. She just didn't always love herself enough to be brave. We found letters she never sent, addressed to him, to me, to Clara, confessions folded into hope, sealed with fear. Reading them hurt, but it also healed something I didn't know was broken. One evening, Clara showed up unannounced. She stood in the doorway, eyes red, posture defensive. Samuel started to leave, but she stopped him. No, she said, stay. She looked at him then, really looked. Did she ever talk about me? She asked. All the time, he replied. She worried about you. She said you carried the weight of the world like it was your responsibility. Clara's shoulders sagged. I was just trying to be enough. I stepped forward. You were. You are. That night we sat together, 3 people bound by one woman's fear and love, finally speaking the truths that had waited too long. Clara didn't forgive, not yet, but she listened, and sometimes that's the first step toward peace. In the weeks that followed, Samuel used the trust money to open a small community cafe, a place where people could sit without being rushed or judged. He named it Eleanor's Bench. I helped him paint the walls. Clara came once, quietly, and left a generous tip. Life didn't become perfect. Families don't tie themselves back together with neat bows. But something shifted. The resentment softened. The silences became less sharp. On the anniversary of my mother's death, we visited her grave together. Samuel placed fresh flowers down and whispered goodbye. Clara stood beside me, close enough that our arms brushed. I don't hate you, she said softly. I just don't know who I am without being the one who knew everything. You don't have to know everything, just enough to be honest. She nodded. That day, I realized the beggar I'd walked in with wasn't the man people should have been ashamed of. He was the truth we'd been avoiding, and sometimes the truth looks poor and inconvenient until you realize it's the richest thing you have. Time doesn't heal everything, but it does give wounds a shape. By the 3rd month after the inheritance meeting, our family had settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt fragile but real. Clara no longer called every day, but she stopped avoiding me. When she did reach out, her voice carried less sharpness, more fatigue. It was the sound of someone finally putting down a burden they'd carried too long. Samuel's cafe became the quiet center of our new lives. Eleanor's bench sat on a corner that used to house a pawn shop, all dim lights and locked windows. Samuel filled it with warmth instead, wooden tables sanded smooth by his own hands, mismatched chairs he rescued and restored, and a long bench by the front window where anyone could sit without buying anything. That part mattered to him most. "People need a place to rest," he told me one morning as we opened together, "even if it's just for 10 minutes. Watching him move through the space felt like watching someone finally exhale after decades of holding their breath. Customers assumed he was the owner because of the way he greeted them, remembered names, asked questions that weren't small talk. They didn't know his history, and he didn't offer it. He didn't need to. I learned things about him slowly, how he once taught literature at a community college before a series of unlucky years unraveled his stability, how pride kept him from asking for help, how my mother, finding him again, had given him not money, but direction. One afternoon, Clara walked in while I was behind the counter. I stiffened instinctively, but she didn't look at me right away. She stood near the doorway, absorbing the space. "This place feels like her," she said finally. Samuel smiled. "That's what I hoped." She nodded, then surprised us both by sitting on the bench. "I don't want special treatment," she said quietly. "I just want coffee." I made it for her myself. When I set the cup down, our fingers brushed and neither of us pulled away. "I read the letters," she said, staring into the mug. "All of them." My chest tightened. "How are you?" She let out a breath that sounded like surrender. Angry, sad, relieved, ashamed of how cruel I was. She glanced up at me. "You didn't steal anything from me." "No, I didn't." She nodded slowly. "I spent my whole life thinking love was something you earned by being useful, by being perfect. She never corrected me." Samuel spoke gently. "She was afraid if she did, you'd stop trying." Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't wipe them away. "I wish she trusted me more." "So do I," said, and I meant it for both of us. The cafe became a place where conversations happened naturally, without pressure. Clara started coming once a week. She never stayed long at first, but eventually she lingered, helping wipe tables, listening to Samuel's stories. She never called him Dad. He never asked her to. Respect grew in the space between them. For me, the biggest shift came quietly. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped shrinking in rooms where Clara once dominated. Knowing where I came from, really knowing, gave me a steadiness I'd never had before. I wasn't competing anymore. I was complete. One evening, after closing, Samuel handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter in my mother's handwriting, dated just days before she died. "If you're reading this, then you've met Samuel as he truly is. I hope you forgive me for the years I stole from you both. I hope you see that love can survive fear, even when it arrives late." I cried into Samuel's shoulder, not from pain alone, but from release. Months later, Clara invited us for dinner. It was awkward at first, polite and careful, but halfway through dessert, she laughed, really laughed at something Samuel said, and the sound startled us all. It felt like a door opening. "I don't know what our family looks like now," she said, "but I don't want to lose it." "Neither do I replied. Samuel raised his glass. "To truth," he said, "even when it's inconvenient." We clinked glasses. I learned then that inheritance isn't just money or property. It's the stories we choose to continue, the silences we finally break, the people we stop pretending not to see. My sister froze that day because the truth walked in wearing clothes she'd been taught to dismiss, but that same truth taught us how to begin again. By the time autumn settled in, Eleanor's bench had become something more than a cafe. It was a refuge. People lingered there in ways they didn't anywhere else, finishing conversations they'd been avoiding, sitting alone without being rushed, letting their guard down just enough to breathe. I watched Samuel greet everyone with the same gentle respect, whether they ordered a single coffee or nothing at all. Clara noticed it too. "I don't understand how you do this," she said one afternoon, watching a man in worn clothes laugh softly with Samuel near the counter. "You make people feel seen." Samuel shrugged. "Everyone wants to be seen." She nodded, thoughtful. For the first time in my memory, Clara wasn't trying to be impressive. She was just present. That shift carried into the rest of her life. She cut back her hours at work, something I never thought I'd see. She stopped treating exhaustion like a badge of honor. When she talked about our mother now, her voice softened instead of tightening. "I think she was scared of being judged," Clara said one evening as we closed up together, "that if anyone knew the whole truth, they'd decide she wasn't worth loving." Samuel smiled sadly. "She was wrong." "So was I," Clara admitted. There was a moment then, quiet, unannounced, when I realized I wasn't waiting for her approval anymore. I loved her, yes, I wanted peace, but my sense of self no longer hinged on her acceptance. That realization felt like freedom. A week later, Clara asked me to go through our mother's remaining things with her, not as an obligation, but as a choice. We sat on the floor of the old bedroom, surrounded by boxes that smelled like dust and lavender. Every item carried a memory, and we handled them carefully like artifacts. "She saved everything," Clara murmured. "She saved what mattered to her," I corrected gently. We found a small wooden box hidden behind winter coats. Inside were photographs, letters, and a pressed flower, brittle with age. Clara picked up one photo and frowned. "That's not Dad," she said. "No," I replied. "It's Samuel." She stared at it for a long moment. "She loved him for a long time." "Yes." Clara swallowed. "I wish she'd trusted me with that." "I think she was protecting you in the only way she knew how." Clara nodded, then surprised me by reaching for my hand. "I was awful to you," she said, "for years." I squeezed her fingers. We were both surviving. That night, I dreamed of my mother smiling, not the strained smile she wore at the end, but the open one from my childhood. When I woke, I felt lighter. Samuel, meanwhile, continued to refuse any title beyond his name, but one morning as we were opening the cafe, I heard myself say, "Dad," without thinking. The word landed between us, fragile and sincere. He froze. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" "No," he interrupted, his eyes shining. "I hoped. I just didn't want to push." He hugged me then, tightly, and for the first time in my life, I felt anchored in a way I hadn't known I was missing. Clara witnessed it a few days later. She didn't react at first, just watched us with an expression I couldn't read. Then she smiled, small but real. "I'm glad you found him," she said to me, "even if it took all this." That night, she stayed late at the cafe, helping Samuel clean up. When she left, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said to him. "For what?" "For staying, when it would have been easier not to." He nodded, understanding more than words could say. As winter approached, Eleanor's bench hosted its first community dinner. Clara volunteered without being asked. I watched her move through the room, not commanding attention, but offering it. Something had shifted permanently. The truth cost us comfort, illusions, and pride, but it gave us something far rarer, honesty without fear. The beggar my sister dismissed had given us back our humanity, and that was an inheritance no document could measure. Winter arrived quietly, without drama, like it understood our family had already endured enough upheaval. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside Eleanor's bench, and Samuel hung a small bell on the door so we could hear when someone came in from the cold. The sound became comforting, a reminder that connection was always just a step away. The community dinner Clara had helped organize became a monthly tradition. People brought dishes passed down through generations, recipes written in looping handwriting, flavors heavy with memory. I watched Clara greet strangers with a softness that would have shocked her former self. She listened now. She asked questions without trying to steer the answers. One night, after everyone had left and the chairs were stacked, she sat across from me at the counter, staring at her hands. "I used to think kindness was weakness," she said, "that if you didn't control the room would swallow you. And now?" I asked. "And now I think I was just afraid," she replied, "afraid no one would choose me if I stopped performing." Samuel, wiping down the espresso machine, spoke without turning around. "People choose you when you let them see you." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm starting to believe that." The cafe attracted people who reminded me of Samuel's past, men and women on the edge of being invisible. He greeted them like old friends. I noticed how he'd slip a sandwich across the counter without ceremony, how he'd listen without fixing, how he never made gratitude a condition. One evening, a young woman approached him, eyes downcast. "You don't remember me," she said, "but you helped me once, years ago." Samuel tilted his head, searching his memory. "You gave me bus fare," she continued. "I was trying to leave a bad situation. You told me I deserved better." He smiled gently. "I'm glad you made it." She left with tears in her eyes. I realized then that Samuel had been a father long before he knew he had a daughter. The holidays came and went. Clara joined us for the first time without tension. She brought a pie, slightly burnt, and laughed at herself when we teased her. It felt normal, precious in its ordinariness. After dinner, she pulled me aside. "I'm thinking of therapy," she said quietly. I blinked. "Really?" She nodded. "I don't want to keep living like love is a transaction." I hugged her, pride swelling in my chest. Samuel faced his own reckoning. One afternoon, he confessed that part of him still felt unworthy of stability. "I keep waiting for this to be taken away," he admitted. "It won't. You're allowed to stay." Those words mattered more than I realized. He repeated them to himself sometimes like a mantra. As spring approached, Samuel received a letter from the community college. They'd heard about the cafe. They wanted him to teach a part-time class, literature and life writing. He stared at the letter in disbelief. "I don't know if I can do that again." "You can, and you should." He accepted. On the first day of class, Clara and I sat in the back, watching him come alive as he spoke about stories and truth. He looked whole. That night, Clara raised a glass. "To second chances," she said. "And to courage," I added. Samuel smiled. "To family," he finished. I thought back to that inheritance meeting, the shock, the cruelty, the frozen moment when truth walked in wearing rags. None of us could have imagined where it would lead. We didn't inherit perfection. We inherited responsibility, the responsibility to do better than silence, better than fear. And for the first time, that felt enough. Spring didn't just arrive outside. It settled into us. The light changed in the cafe, stretching longer across the wooden floors, catching dust motes like they were part of the decor. Eleanor's bench felt alive in a new way, not just as a refuge, but as a beginning. Samuel's first semester back at the community college was harder than he let on. I could see it in the way he rehearsed his lectures aloud in the evenings, pacing the cafe after closing, correcting himself gently, like he was afraid to take up too much authority. The past had taught him caution. Stability still felt borrowed to him, like something that could be revoked if he wasn't careful enough. "You don't have to earn this every day," I told him once when he confessed he was afraid of failing the students. "You already belong." He smiled, but it took time for the words to sink in. Clara attended one of his classes, sitting quietly in the back row. Afterward, she approached him, her posture uncharacteristically unsure. "You were good," she said, then corrected herself. "No, you were right. You made them think." Samuel laughed softly. "That's the goal." She hesitated. "I don't say this enough, but I'm proud of you." The word proud hung between them, fragile and sincere. Samuel nodded, visibly moved. It wasn't the relationship either of them had imagined, but it was real, and real was better. Around that time, Clara's marriage began to shift too. Daniel started coming to the cafe, at first reluctantly, then with curiosity. He watched the way Clara interacted with people there, how she softened, how she listened. "She's different," he said to me one afternoon, "in a good way." "She always had it in her. She just didn't feel safe enough to show it." Their conversations grew longer, less transactional. They began to talk about things they'd avoided for years, resentments, fears, the quiet loneliness that can exist even in polished lives. I realized that truth, once unleashed, has a way of rippling outward, touching everything it encounters. For me, the biggest change came in my own reflection. I no longer felt like the lesser sister, the emotional one who needed to justify her place. I felt grounded. Knowing Samuel didn't replace the man who raised me, but it reframed my story. I wasn't an accident or an afterthought. I was chosen twice, once in fear, once in truth. One afternoon, Samuel found me sorting through donation books in the back. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. I looked up. "Okay." Would you be willing to come to one of my readings, not as my daughter, just as yourself?" I smiled. "I'd like that." The reading took place in a small library room, filled with folding chairs and the smell of old pages. Samuel read a piece about loss and forgiveness, about how love can survive neglect if given room to breathe. I watched the audience lean in, rapt, unaware of how personal his words were. Afterward, a woman approached him. "Your story gave me hope," she said. "I've been estranged from my son for 10 years. Samuel nodded. "It's never too late to tell the truth." That night, as we locked up the cafe, he turned to me. "Your mother would have loved this," he said. "I know," I replied, and for once the thought didn't hurt, it warmed. Clara joined us later, bringing takeout and wine. We sat on the bench by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. "I used to think inheritance was about control," she said suddenly, "about getting what you deserved." "And now?" I asked. "And now I think it's about what you do with what you're given, even if what you're given is inconvenient." We laughed softly. I thought about the day she froze at the inheritance meeting, about the way her certainty shattered when Samuel walked in. That moment had terrified her, but it had also freed her. The beggar she dismissed had become the quiet architect of our healing, not because he demanded anything, but because he refused to disappear. Some families are built on shared blood. Others are rebuilt on shared truth. Ours was both now, imperfect and honest, stitched together by courage we didn't know we had. And every time the bell on the cafe door rang, I was reminded that belonging doesn't always arrive dressed the way you expect. Sometimes it walks in quietly and changes everything. By summer, Eleanor's bench had become woven into the neighborhood in a way none of us had planned. People didn't just come for coffee anymore. They came to talk, to confess, to sit in silence with someone who didn't rush them out of it. Samuel said the place felt like a living room that happened to serve espresso, and I knew exactly what he meant. The anniversary of the inheritance meeting crept up on me unexpectedly. I didn't mark it on a calendar, but my body remembered. I found myself restless, distracted, replaying that moment when Clara froze, when everything we thought was solid cracked open. I mentioned it to Samuel one evening after closing. He nodded slowly. "Some days stay with you," he said, "not because they hurt, but because they changed you." Clara felt it too. She called me that week, asking if I wanted to take a walk by the river. That alone told me something was on her mind. We walked in silence at first, the water moving steadily beside us. Finally, she spoke. "I was cruel to you that day," she said. "Not just dismissive, cruel." "I know, but I also know why." She stopped walking. "No, you don't get to excuse me anymore. I treated you like you were less because it made me feel safer." Her voice broke. "I'm sorry." The apology landed deep, not because I'd been waiting for it, but because it was honest. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've spent my whole life being afraid of losing what I have. Turned out I was losing people instead." That night, we ate dinner together without talking about the past. We didn't need to. Presence was enough. Samuel, meanwhile, was learning to receive care as much as he gave it. One afternoon, a regular customer brought him a new coat, insisting the old one had done enough. He resisted at first, then accepted with a quiet gratitude that felt like a victory. "You're allowed to be cared for," I reminded him later. He smiled. "I'm learning." The cafe hosted its first open mic night that month. Stories spilled out of loss, forgiveness, second chances. Clara surprised me by reading something she'd written, a piece about perfection and exhaustion. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat, then erupted in applause. Clara looked stunned, then quietly proud. Afterward, she turned to Samuel. "I think I finally understand why she loved you." Samuel met her gaze. "She loved you too," he said, "in every way she knew how." I realized then that love doesn't have to be equal to be real. It just has to be honest. As the night wound down, I stepped outside for air. The street was warm, alive with quiet laughter and distant music. I thought about how far we'd come from that sterile living room, from the sharp edges of inheritance and judgment. My sister froze because she saw a reflection of everything she'd been taught to fear: poverty, vulnerability, truth. But that same moment taught her that dignity isn't something you inherit, it's something you practice. Samuel joined me outside. "You okay?" he asked. "I am," I said, and I meant it. The truth had taken its time revealing itself, but when it arrived, it didn't destroy us. It showed us who we could be. The first real test of our new family didn't arrive with shouting or accusations. It came quietly, the way most lasting challenges do. Samuel got sick. It started with a cough he brushed off, then fatigue he blamed on teaching and late nights at the cafe. I noticed the way he sat down more often, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. When I finally insisted he see a doctor, he tried to wave me away with a smile that didn't quite hold. "I've been through worse," he said. "That's not a reason to go through it alone," I replied. The diagnosis wasn't dramatic, but it was serious enough to stop us in our tracks. A condition that had gone untreated for years, manageable now, but only if he slowed down, only if he accepted help. That part was hardest for him. "I don't want to be a burden," he said one night, sitting at the cafe long after closing, the lights dimmed low. "You're not," I said immediately. "I've spent my life being careful not to need anyone. Needing people feels dangerous." I sat across from him, steady. "So did loving us," I said, "and you did it anyway." Clara reacted differently when she found out. She went into action mode, researching specialists, organizing schedules, coordinating volunteers to help at the cafe. At first, it felt familiar in an uncomfortable way, like she was slipping back into control. Then, one afternoon, she broke. I found her in the storage room, sitting on a crate, her face in her hands. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "I just got him." I sat beside her. "You're not losing him, but you don't have to carry this by yourself." She nodded, tears slipping through her fingers. "I don't know how to just be scared without fixing everything. You're doing it right now, I told her. Samuel watched us navigate his illness with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. He hated canceling classes, hated closing the cafe early, hated being the one who needed care instead of offering it. One evening, a group of regulars showed up with homemade soup, cards, and quiet determination. They took over the cafe without asking, brewing coffee, wiping tables, laughing softly like they'd always belonged there. Samuel sat in the corner, overwhelmed. "I never asked for this," he said. "No," I replied. "You earned it." Recovery was slow. There were setbacks, long nights, moments when fear crept in uninvited. But there was also something else: presence. Clara sat with Samuel during appointments, not managing, just listening. I read to him when he was too tired to talk. We learned how to exist together in stillness. One afternoon, Samuel looked at us both and said, "Your mother used to say family is who shows up when it's inconvenient." Clara smiled weakly. She had a way of being right too late. "Maybe not too late," I said. As summer edged toward fall again, Samuel grew stronger. The cafe reopened fully, his classes resumed. Life didn't snap back into place, but it moved forward, altered and wiser. On the anniversary of my mother's death, we gathered at Eleanor's bench after closing. No speeches, no formal rituals, just 3 cups of coffee and a quiet understanding. "I spent years thinking I had to earn love. Now I know it's something you protect." Samuel nodded. "And something you accept." I looked at them, my sister, my father, and felt a sense of peace I'd never known before. The inheritance meeting had shattered our illusions, but it had also given us a chance to rebuild something real. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind, but the truth you finally tell. My sister froze that day because the past walked in uninvited, but in doing so, it gave us a future we never would have chosen, yet couldn't imagine living without. The year turned over quietly after Samuel's illness, like it was giving us a respectful nod for surviving it. Nothing in our lives felt flashy or dramatic anymore. Instead, everything felt deliberate, chosen, and that, I learned, was its own kind of miracle. Eleanor's bench celebrated its 2nd anniversary with no banners, no speeches, just a longer line than usual and a stack of handwritten notes taped to the wall near the counter. People thanked Samuel for listening, for feeding them when they were hungry, for not asking questions that came with shame attached. He read each note slowly, like he was afraid to miss something important. "I never planned any of this," he told me later. "I just didn't want to disappear." "You didn't," I said. "You showed us how not to." Clara changed in ways that still surprised me. She stepped back from the company she'd built her identity around and took a role that gave her weekends off. She started volunteering at a legal clinic, helping people navigate systems she'd once thrived in, but now understood from the other side. "I used to believe rules were the same as justice," she said one night over dinner. "They're not." Her marriage with Daniel didn't magically fix itself, but it softened. They learned how to talk without winning. Sometimes that meant admitting they'd grown apart. Sometimes it meant choosing to stay anyway. Either way, it was honest. As for me, I began writing, not for an audience at first, just for myself. I wrote about the inheritance meeting, about the way my sister froze, about the man in worn clothes who carried more truth than all the polished furniture in that room. Writing helped me trace the invisible threads that had always been there, binding us together even when we were pretending otherwise. Samuel read my first piece quietly, then handed it back to me with shaking hands. "You captured her," he said, "and us." Encouraged, I kept going. Eventually, I shared one of my essays at the cafe's open mic night. Clara sat in the front row, eyes never leaving me. When I finished, she was crying, openly, unapologetically. "I didn't know you felt all that," she said afterward. "I didn't know I was allowed to," I replied. That became a turning point for both of us. We stopped assuming the worst of each other. We started asking. One evening, as we closed up together, Samuel looked around the cafe and sighed. "Your mother would have loved this chaos," he said with a smile. "She built it," Clara replied. "She just didn't know it yet." We laughed softly. The truth is, families don't heal all at once. They heal in conversations that almost don't happen, in apologies that arrive late but land true, in moments of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. I used to think inheritance was about fairness, about who got what and why. Now I know it's about responsibility, about what you do when the truth hands you a choice. My sister froze because the life she'd built depended on everything staying exactly as it was. But life doesn't work that way. Truth has a way of knocking even when you don't invite it in. When it does, you can turn away or you can let it change you. We chose the second.